They saw her as just another broken-hearted woman running away, but she carried the strength of someone ready to rebuild from ashes. The California morning mist clung to Elena Castellano's traveling dress as she stood on the San Francisco Depot platform, her leather satchel heavy with letters from a Texas rancher she had never met. The scent of ocean salt mixed with coal smoke from the waiting locomotive, creating a bittersweet farewell to the only life she had ever known. Her dark eyes, still swollen from tears shed in the early morning hours, gazed westward toward an uncertain future that stretched as wide as the Texas plains she would soon call home. The conductor's bell rang sharp against the dawn air, and Elena felt her heart constrict with the finality of it. Behind her lay the ruins of everything she had believed in: love, trust, and the promises whispered in moonlit gardens by a man who had chosen another woman's fortune over Elena's devotion. The memory of finding them together, her former fiancé and the banker's daughter, still burned like acid in her chest. But ahead lay something unknown, something that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. The train car smelled of worn leather and unwashed bodies, a harsh contrast to the rose water and silk that had defined her California existence. Elena pressed her face to the window as the familiar hills of her childhood disappeared into morning haze, replaced by endless stretches of unfamiliar landscape that grew more stark and beautiful with each passing hour. Her fingers traced the rough edges of James Whitmore's letters, worn soft from countless readings during the long nights when sleep refused to come. James had written with careful penmanship about his ranch in the Texas Hill Country, about cattle that dotted his land like scattered stars, about morning mist that rose from the creek that ran through his property. His words carried a loneliness that matched her own, though his had been carved by the death of his first wife rather than betrayal. There was something in his letters that spoke of a man who understood loss, who would not judge her for arriving with a heart full of splinters rather than hopes. The train rocked steadily through California's Central Valley, past orchards heavy with fruit that would ripen without her there to see it. Elena had grown up among those trees, had climbed their branches as a child and dreamed beneath their shade as a young woman foolish enough to believe in forever promises. Now the sight of them made her chest tight with mourning for the girl she had been just 3 months ago, before she discovered that love could be bought and sold like any other commodity. As the landscape changed from green California hills to the harsh beauty of desert scrubland, Elena felt something shifting inside her chest. The further she traveled from the life that had shattered, the easier it became to breathe. The train's rhythm became a lullaby of possibility, each clack of the wheels carrying her closer to a man who had chosen her not for her father's business connections or her family's social standing, but simply because her letters had moved him to write back with increasing warmth and frequency. She had been honest with James about her circumstances, though she had softened the brutal edges of her heartbreak. She told him she was seeking a fresh start, that California held too many painful memories, that she wanted to build something real with someone who valued partnership over performance. He had written back with understanding that felt like cool water on a burn, telling her about his own struggles with loneliness and his hope that two people who had known loss might build something stronger together than either could manage alone. The Texas border announced itself with a change in the very air, drier and thinner than California's coastal softness. Elena watched the sun set over land so vast, it made her feel simultaneously insignificant and infinite. The other passengers dozed or played cards, but she remained pressed to the window, watching darkness swallow the endless horizon. Somewhere out there, James Whitmore was going about his evening routines, perhaps wondering if she would truly arrive as promised or if she would lose her nerve and return to the familiar safety of her former life. But there was no safety in her former life anymore. The man she had loved had made that impossible when he chose wealth over heart, when he stood in her family's parlor and explained with businesslike precision why he could not marry a woman whose father's fortune had been lost to poor investments and market crashes. The humiliation had been complete when she learned he had been courting the banker's daughter even while professing his devotion to Elena's dark eyes and gentle hands. The train pulled into Dallas as dawn painted the sky the color of fresh peaches, and Elena felt her stomach flutter with nerves that had nothing to do with the swaying car or the meager breakfast she had managed to choke down. This was her connection point, where she would board a smaller train that would carry her to the tiny town of Cedar Creek, where James had promised to meet her with his wagon and the beginning of whatever they might build together. As she transferred her single trunk and leather satchel to the local train, Elena caught sight of herself in the depot's cracked mirror. The woman looking back had changed during the long journey, had lost some of the soft edges that California comfort had given her. Her dark hair, once arranged in elaborate styles befitting her social position, now hung in a simple braid down her back. Her traveling dress, though still fine quality, had wrinkled and lost its pristine perfection. But her eyes, those eyes that had once sparkled with naive trust, now held a steadiness that had been earned through heartbreak and the decision to rise from its ashes. The smaller train moved at a more leisurely pace through the Texas Hill Country, giving Elena time to absorb the wild beauty of her new home. Rolling hills covered in cedar and oak stretched as far as she could see, broken by clear streams and meadows dotted with wildflowers that painted the landscape in shades of blue and yellow and red. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, tinged with cedar and grass and something indefinable that spoke of space and freedom and the possibility of starting over. Cedar Creek announced itself with a weathered sign and a small depot that looked like it had been built as an afterthought. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as the train shuddered to a stop, as the conductor called out the name of what would either become her salvation or her second great mistake. She gathered her courage along with her belongings, stepping onto the platform with legs that felt uncertain after so many hours of confinement. A tall figure detached itself from the shade of the depot building, and Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. James Whitmore was larger than she had imagined from his letters, broader through the shoulders and longer in the limbs, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of countless hours working under the Texas sky. His dark hair curled slightly at the edges where it touched his collar, and his eyes, when they met hers across the platform, were the color of creek water running over smooth stones. They stood there for a moment that stretched like pulled taffy, each taking the measure of the other, comparing reality to imagination and hope. Elena felt a flutter of something that might have been disappointment or relief or simple recognition that this was the man who had written to her with such careful honesty about loneliness and loss and the hope for something better. James approached with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, his hat held respectfully in his hands. His voice, when he spoke, carried the soft drawl of Texas but also something gentler, more educated than she had expected from a rancher's letters. "Miss Castellano," he said, and the sound of her name in his mouth felt like a question and an answer all at once. "I hope the journey was not too difficult for you." Elena found her voice somewhere in the tangle of nerves and exhaustion and strange anticipation that filled her chest. "Mr. Whitmore," she replied, managing a smile that felt more genuine than any she had worn in months. "The journey was long, but I am grateful to be here safely." Something in her voice or her smile seemed to ease the tension in his shoulders, and James stepped forward to take her trunk with hands that were strong and work-roughened but gentle as they brushed briefly against hers. His wagon waited in the depot's shade, pulled by two horses whose coats gleamed like polished mahogany in the afternoon sun. As they loaded her belongings into the wagon bed, Elena became aware of curious eyes watching from the depot and the small businesses that lined Cedar Creek's main street. She had expected this, had prepared herself for the scrutiny that would follow a mail-order bride's arrival in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. But James seemed to sense her discomfort, positioning himself between her and the watching eyes as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. The ride to his ranch took them through countryside that grew more beautiful with each passing mile. Hills rolled away in every direction, covered in a tapestry of green that was different from California's lush abundance but no less lovely in its wild, untamed way. James pointed out landmarks as they traveled, his voice taking on warmth as he spoke of his land, his cattle, the creek that provided water for his stock and his small garden. Elena found herself relaxing despite her nerves, lulled by James's easy conversation and the rhythmic creak of wagon wheels over packed earth. He asked careful questions about her journey, about her first impressions of Texas, about small things that required no painful revelations about her past. It was clear he understood that she needed time to find her footing before delving into deeper waters. The ranch house appeared around a bend in the dirt road like something from a dream Elena had never dared to have. It was larger than she had expected from James's modest descriptions, built of native stone with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides and windows that caught the afternoon light like welcoming eyes. Gardens flanked the front steps, carefully tended beds of vegetables and herbs that spoke of someone who took pleasure in growing things. As James helped her down from the wagon, Elena felt something settle in her chest that she had not experienced since her world fell apart in California. This place felt like sanctuary, like a haven where broken hearts might heal and new dreams might take root. The air smelled of cedar and grass and the promise of rain building in the western sky, and she breathed it in like medicine for her wounded spirit. James carried her trunk into the house while Elena stood on the porch, taking in the view that would greet her each morning if she chose to make this place her home. Hills rolled away toward the horizon, dotted with cattle that looked like toys from this distance. A creek glinted silver in the late afternoon light, and hawks circled overhead on currents of warm air that carried the scent of wild sage and freedom. The inside of the house surprised her with its comfort and careful attention to detail. James had clearly prepared for her arrival, had made space in his life for another person's belongings and preferences. The rooms were simply furnished but clean and well-maintained, with touches that spoke of a man who took pride in his home. Books lined shelves in the main room, their spines worn from handling, and Elena felt a flicker of pleasure at the thought of long evenings spent reading by the stone fireplace. James showed her to a room that would be hers, a space that looked out over the gardens and the rolling hills beyond. The bed was covered with a quilt that looked handmade, and fresh wildflowers stood in a jar on the small table by the window. The gesture touched her more than elaborate gifts ever had, this simple acknowledgement that he had thought of her comfort and pleasure in this space that would be her sanctuary. As evening settled over the ranch, James prepared a simple meal while Elena unpacked her few belongings and tried to process the enormity of the changes that had brought her to this place. The man moving efficiently around his kitchen was nothing like the pampered society gentleman who had broken her heart in California. James's hands were calloused from honest work, his movements economical and purposeful. There was a steadiness about him that felt like bedrock after months of emotional quicksand. They ate by lamplight, the conversation flowing more easily than Elena had dared to hope. James asked about her family, her interests, her thoughts about ranch life, and she found herself answering with more honesty than she had planned. He told her about his cattle, his hopes for expanding the ranch, his love for this wild country that could be harsh and beautiful in the same breath. When Elena mentioned her uncertainty about fitting into ranch life, James's expression grew thoughtful. He told her about his first wife, Sarah, who had come to Texas from a big city back east and had struggled initially with the isolation and the demanding nature of frontier life. But she had learned to love it, he said, had found peace in the vast skies and freedom in the absence of social constraints that had bound her former life. The parallel was not lost on Elena, and she felt a flutter of something that might have been hope beginning to unfurl in her chest. Perhaps her California heartbreak had not been an ending but a doorway, a painful but necessary step towards something better than she had ever imagined possible. As the evening deepened, James walked her to the porch where they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the Texas hills. Coyotes sang in the distance, their voices wild and free, and owls called from the oak trees that shaded the house. The stars, unpolluted by city lights, blazed overhead with an intensity that took Elena's breath away. James spoke quietly about his loneliness since Sarah's death, about letters that had become his lifeline to the possibility of companionship and understanding. Elena found herself sharing more than she had intended about her own heartbreak, about the betrayal that had sent her fleeing west toward uncertainty and hope in equal measure. There was something healing in the darkness and the distance from her past that allowed Elena to speak truths she had held locked inside her chest. James listened without judgment, his presence steady and reassuring as she fumbled through explanations of how her world had crumbled and why she had chosen to answer his advertisement for a wife rather than retreat into spinster safety with her remaining family. As the night grew late, James made it clear that he expected nothing from her beyond her presence and the chance to build something real together over time. The relief that flooded through Elena at his words was so intense it brought tears to her eyes. After months of feeling pressured and manipulated and used, his respect for her autonomy felt like the greatest gift he could have offered. The days that followed established a rhythm that soothed Elena's battered spirit. She woke each morning to the sound of James moving quietly through the house, preparing for his day of ranch work. The view from her window changed with the light and weather, sometimes revealing cattle grazing peacefully in the pastures, sometimes showing rain sweeping across the hills like gray curtains. James was patient with her adjustment to ranch life, understanding that she needed time to find her place in this new world. He taught her about the cattle, the horses, the endless cycle of work that kept the ranch functioning. Elena discovered she had an unexpected aptitude for the practical skills that Texas life demanded, finding satisfaction in tasks that would have horrified her California social circle. She learned to tend the garden that provided vegetables for their table, to milk the cow that grazed in the pasture behind the house, to collect eggs from the chickens that pecked and scratched in their carefully fenced yard. Her hands, once soft and pampered, began to show the marks of honest work, and she found herself taking pride in calluses that spoke of useful skills rather than ornamental accomplishments. James watched her adaptation with eyes that grew warmer each day, and Elena began to understand that she was not simply filling a void left by his first wife's death. She was becoming something new, something uniquely herself in this place that rewarded authenticity over artifice. The woman she had been in California, concerned with fashion and social position, and securing an advantageous marriage, began to seem like a stranger whose priorities had been dangerously misplaced. As weeks passed into months, Elena felt the sharp edges of her heartbreak beginning to smooth under the healing influence of useful work and genuine respect. James never pressed her for more than she was ready to give, never made her feel like she owed him anything beyond her honest effort to build a life together. His courtship was gentle and patient, conducted through shared meals and evening conversations and small gestures of consideration that meant more than expensive gifts ever had. The Texas seasons rolled over the ranch like waves, each bringing its own challenges and beauty. Elena learned to read the sky for signs of weather, to anticipate the needs of animals and growing things, to find joy in simple pleasures that had been invisible to her former life. She watched James work with his hands and his heart, saw the satisfaction he took in caring for his land and livestock, and began to understand that she had found something in Texas that California society had never offered her. The transformation was not always easy. There were days when homesickness struck her like a physical blow, when the isolation of ranch life felt overwhelming, when she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake in fleeing so far from everything familiar. But James seemed to sense these moments of doubt, appeared at her side with quiet understanding and the steady presence that had become her anchor in this new world. During a particularly difficult evening when Elena found herself weeping for the life she had lost rather than the one she was building, James sat beside her on the porch and spoke with rare openness about his own struggles with change and loss. He told her about the months after Sarah's death, when he had questioned everything, when the ranch that had once felt like paradise became a prison of memories and might-have beens. But time and work and the healing power of this wild country had gradually restored his sense of purpose, he said. The land demanded attention to the present moment, to the immediate needs of animals and growing things, and gradually those demands had pulled him out of the past, and into engagement with life as it was rather than as it had been. Elena felt something shift in her chest as she listened to James speak about healing and acceptance and the courage required to remain open to new possibilities even after devastating loss. His words felt like permission to stop punishing herself for the failure of her California dreams, to embrace the different but no less valuable future that was taking shape around her. The evening she realized she was falling in love with James Whitmore came not with dramatic revelation but with quiet recognition of feelings that had been growing like wildflowers in her heart. She was watching him work with a young colt in the corral, his movements patient and sure as he helped the animal learn to accept human guidance without losing its essential wildness. There was something in the way James approached the task, with respect for the colt's fear and natural instincts, that reminded Elena of how he had treated her own wariness and emotional wounds. He had never tried to force her healing or demand more trust than she was ready to give. Instead, he had simply been present and reliable, allowing her to come to him in her own time and on her own terms. The realization that she loved him brought not anxiety but a deep sense of rightness, as if a piece of herself that had been lost was finally clicking back into place. This was not the desperate, grasping emotion she had felt for her former fiancé, built on insecurity and the need for validation. This was something steadier and stronger, rooted in genuine respect and shared values and the daily intimacy of building a life together. That night, as they sat on their porch listening to the eternal conversation between wind and grass, Elena found the courage to tell James what had been growing in her heart. His response was not surprise, but recognition. And when he kissed her under the blazing Texas stars, it felt like coming home to herself after a long and painful journey. Their wedding was a simple affair held in the Cedar Creek Church, attended by neighbors who had watched Elena's transformation from frightened refugee to confident ranch wife, with approval and affection. She wore a dress of blue calico that she had sewn herself, practical and beautiful in its simplicity, and carried wildflowers picked from the meadows surrounding their home. As Elena spoke her vows to James in the small wooden church, she felt the last chains of her California heartbreak finally falling away. The woman who had fled west in shame and desperate hope was gone, replaced by someone stronger and wiser and infinitely more at peace with herself and her choices. The life they built together was not without challenges, but Elena had learned the difference between obstacles that could be overcome with effort and devotion and those that arose from fundamental incompatibilities and misplaced values. When drought threatened their cattle, she and James worked together to find solutions. When illness struck their small community, they opened their home to those in need. When loneliness crept in during the long winter months, they had each other and the books they read aloud by firelight and the plans they made for spring. Years passed, and Elena's letters to her sister in California began to reflect not the bitter woman who had fled heartbreak, but someone who had found genuine contentment in an unexpected place. She wrote about the satisfaction of work that mattered, about love that was built on respect rather than desperation, about a community that valued character over social position. The ranch prospered under their joint efforts, growing from James's original modest holdings to something approaching prosperity. Elena's practical skills and business sense complemented James's knowledge of cattle and land management, and together they created something more successful than either could have achieved alone. But more than financial success, they had built the kind of partnership that Elena had never imagined possible during her California youth. Their marriage was a daily choice to support and challenge and cherish each other, to work together towards shared goals while maintaining the individual strengths that made their union valuable. On quiet evenings when the ranch work was done and they sat together watching the sunset paint the Texas hills in shades of gold and crimson, Elena sometimes thought about the woman she had been and the heartbreak that had seemed like the end of everything worth having. That pain had been the catalyst that brought her to this place, to this man, to this life that fit her like a favorite dress worn soft with love and use. The California girl who had believed love meant security and social advancement was gone, replaced by a Texas woman who understood that the deepest happiness came not from having her needs met by another person, but from meeting challenges together with someone whose values aligned with her own. The heartbreak that had driven her west had not been punishment, but preparation for something better than her limited imagination had ever conceived. As stars emerged in the darkening sky and James's hand found hers in the gathering twilight, Elena offered silent gratitude to the pain that had set her free from a life too small for her true self. Sometimes the most devastating losses were actually doorways to the life we were meant to live, and sometimes the bravest thing we could do was step through them toward an uncertain, but infinitely more authentic future. The woman who had once been broken by betrayal now knew the strength that comes from rebuilding yourself on your own terms, and she would carry that knowledge like armor against whatever challenges the future might bring to their small corner of the vast Texas sky.